When our HOA president, Karen, hit us with a ridiculous fine for parking in our own driveway, she had no clue my dad was the banker reviewing their $1 million loan application. Ever wonder what happens when a power-drunk HOA crosses the wrong family? I stared at the bright pink notice tucked under my windshield wiper, my stomach sinking like a rock. $150 fine. Driveway violation, it read in bold black print. Seriously, this was our own driveway. My sister Jenny's graduation party had gone late the night before. A few relatives had stayed the night, leaving their cars in our driveway. Everything seemed fine when I went to sleep. "Dad," I shouted, rushing back into the house, "you need to see this." My father, Thomas Reynolds, looked up from his morning coffee, his brow creasing with concern. As a senior loan officer at First National Bank, he dealt in regulations daily, but even he looked puzzled by the ticket. "This makes no sense," he murmured, scanning the details. "It says we broke Section 7.3 of the Pinecrest Gardens HOA rules," he added, "for having more than 2 vehicles in the driveway." Mom walked in, still wearing her robe. "That's absurd. It's our own property." Dad grabbed his phone. "I'm calling the HOA right now." His expression changed from confused to ticked off as he hit speakerphone. "Pinecrest Gardens HOA, this is Karen Matthews speaking," came a crisp voice. "Hi, this is Thomas Reynolds from 428 Maple Drive," Dad said. "We got a parking violation for having family in our driveway. There must be a misunderstanding." The chuckle that came through the speaker made my skin crawl. Cold. Smug. "No misunderstanding, Mr. Reynolds. Section 7.3 is clear. No more than 2 cars allowed in the driveway. You had 5. That's a $150 fine." Dad's tone stayed calm, but I could see his grip tighten on the phone. "Karen, it was my daughter's graduation, just overnight guests. Surely there's an exception for family events." "Rules are rules, Mr. Reynolds. If we allowed chaos, the whole neighborhood would look like a used car lot. Payment is due in 10 days. After that it doubles." "This feels excessive," Dad replied. "Is there a way to appeal at the next board meeting?" "You're welcome to try," Karen answered coolly, "but I chair the board, and I personally documented the violation. The evidence is clear." As the call ended, I peeked through the blinds and spotted a woman across the street, perfectly curled blonde hair, phone in hand, staring straight at our house. She wore pricey workout clothes and had that smug look people get when they think they've won. "Dad," I whispered, "I think that's her watching us." He joined me at the window. "Karen Matthews," he said lowly, "moved in 6 months ago. Just got herself elected HOA president last month. First time I've ever talked to her." That afternoon, Dad and I dug into the HOA documents. Sure enough, the rule about driveway parking existed, buried on page 37 of a 50-page packet we'd barely skimmed when we moved in 3 years ago. "This is insane," I said. "Why does it matter how many cars we park for one night?" Dad rubbed his forehead. "Some people crave control. Let's pay the fine for now. But I want to read these rules carefully." Just after dinner, the doorbell rang. Our neighbor, Mr. Jackson, stood there looking concerned. "Sorry to bother you, Reynolds family," he said. "Saw your ticket. Thought I'd give you a heads up. Karen's just getting started." He explained how his son's basketball hoop was ordered down last week, even though it had been there for 5 years. The Garcias were fined for planting the wrong flower color. Elderly Mrs. Wilson got a warning because her bird feeder was too tall. "She's on a power trip," Mr. Jackson sighed, "and none of us know how to stop her." After he left, Dad stayed unusually quiet, focused on his laptop. "What are you looking at?" I asked. "Property maps," he replied. "And the HOA's financial reports. They're public for residents." The next morning, another pink slip appeared, this time taped to our mailbox. "Improper lawn maintenance. Grass exceeds 3.5 inches. Fine, $75. I rushed inside, furious. Dad, she's coming after us now. He took the paper calmly. I figured she might. I mowed 4 days ago. Mom threw her hands up. This is harassment. Should we get a lawyer? Dad had a look in his eye I hadn't seen before. Not yet. I found something interesting last night. The HOA is planning a $1.2 million renovation of the community center. So? I asked. So Karen and her board need that loan approved soon, before winter construction starts. He grinned. And guess which bank they applied to? My eyes widened. First National? Your bank? He nodded. And guess who's assigned to review their application? A slow smile spread across my face. You. Sometimes, Dad said softly, the universe has a sense of humor. Outside, Karen was walking past our house with a measuring tape and a camera, checking our lawn. She had no idea what she'd just stirred up. This is out of control, Mom said, spreading 5 violation slips on the kitchen table. In just a week, we'd been hit for the driveway, grass, a garden gnome not on the approved list, wind chimes deemed too loud, a hose not properly coiled, and a mailbox that was apparently 1 shade too dark. Total 425s. Dad hadn't paid any of them. Instead, every night he made phone calls from his office, using that calm banker voice of his. When the doorbell rang again, we all jumped. These days, surprise visits meant more bad news. It was Mrs. Smith from a few houses down, holding a pink citation of her own. Her eyes were red from crying. Is your dad home? She asked. I don't know what to do anymore. 5 minutes later, our living room was packed with neighbors. The Garcias, the Smiths, the Jacksons, even Dr. Patel from the corner. Each one had a horror story about Karen. She fined me because my medical delivery box sat outside for 4 hours, Dr. Patel said. I was in surgery. Mrs. Wilson wiped her eyes. She says my bird feeders attract pests. I've lived here for 32 years. Those birds are my only company. Dad listened, taking notes. When everyone finished, he cleared his throat. I've been doing some research, he said, turning his laptop around. Last year, before Karen arrived, the HOA collected about $5,000 in fines total. In the 2 months since she took over, they've pulled in over $12,000. Gasps echoed across the room. But here's the kicker, Dad continued. Bylaw says all fine money must go toward community improvements. But, based on financial reports, none of these new fines are recorded. What does that mean? Mrs. Garcia asked. It means, Dad said slowly, the money could be going somewhere it shouldn't. And now, just as they're applying for $1 million loan, that's a big problem. The room went silent. What can we do? Mr. Jackson asked. Dad smiled. As part of the loan review, I've requested a full audit of the HOA's finances for the past year. Standard for loans this size. My chest swelled with pride. Dad wasn't getting revenge. He was doing everything by the book, smart and steady. Won't she figure out it's you? Mrs. Smith asked. Bank rules require confidentiality, Dad said. She'll know the bank is auditing, but not that I'm handling it. Then my phone buzzed. A text from my friend Zach. OMG. Did you see Karen's Facebook post? I pulled it up. Karen had posted a long rant about certain families disrespecting community standards and lowering property values. No names, but everyone knew who she meant. She's trying to turn people against us, Mom said. Dad stayed calm. This actually helps us. She's creating a public record. Later that day, while walking our dog Max, I noticed something odd. Karen's best friend Diane had a giant RV parked in her yard. According to the rules we'd read, RVs weren't allowed. I snapped a photo and showed Dad. Interesting, he said. Let's start documenting everything. Over dinner, Dad laid out his plan. The next HOA board meeting is Tuesday. We should all go. She'll shut us down, I said. She can try, Dad replied, but the bylaws guarantee every member a voice, and we won't be alone. He was right. That Tuesday the community center was packed. Karen looked stunned. She sped through the agenda until she hit the renovation project. The loan is progressing, she said quickly. Excuse me, Dad stood. As a member, I'd like more details. Karen's smile stiffened. Those are confidential. Actually, Dad said calmly, since the loan uses community property as collateral, we have the right to full disclosure. Article 4, Section 2. Silence fell. Karen flushed. Fine, she snapped. We're borrowing $1.2 million from First National Bank for renovations. The application is in review. And what's the status of that review? Dad asked innocently. Karen's eye twitched. There have been unexpected requests for more documentation. Like what? Someone called out. Karen hesitated. Financial records. It's just standard red tape. Dad raised his hand again. On the subject of finances, your last statement lists only $3,200 collected in fines. But plenty of us have paid way more than that altogether. Karen's eyes flicked to Diane, who was now frantically shaking her head. Those fines haven't been officially processed yet, Karen stuttered. An older man stood up in the back of the room. I paid my fine 8 weeks ago. You cashed my check the next day. The room erupted with voices. Everyone started comparing stories, citing fines they'd paid that never appeared in the official records. Karen slammed her gavel repeatedly. This meeting is over, she shouted above the noise. As people spilled out into the hallway, buzzing with anger and questions, Karen cornered Dad near the exit. I stayed just close enough to catch their exchange. I don't know what kind of stunt you're pulling, Reynolds, she hissed, but you're messing with someone who has power. Dad met her glare without flinching. I'm not playing games, Karen. I'm making sure this community plays by the rules, all of them. We walked home under the glow of streetlights, a small crowd of neighbors following us like a slow-moving parade. What now? Mrs. Wilson asked. Dad looked thoughtful. The audit results should be back from the bank in 2 weeks. If there are inconsistencies, he didn't need to finish, we all got the message. That night I couldn't sleep. Around midnight I heard a car door slam and peeked through the blinds. Someone was creeping around our front yard with a flashlight. Our motion lights clicked on, and the beam caught Karen holding something in her hands. Startled, she froze for a second, then bolted back to her car and sped off. In the morning we discovered all our garden plants had been ripped out and tossed across the lawn. Taped to our door was another violation slip. Landscaping debris. Fine, $200. But Karen had messed up. Our doorbell cam recorded everything. Dad stormed into the kitchen, dropping his briefcase with more force than usual. His face was flushed with a rare kind of anger. Guess what landed on my desk today? He asked, pulling out a thick folder marked with the Pinecrest Gardens HOA logo. My jaw dropped. No way. He nodded and spread the documents across the table. The HOA's asking for $1.2 million to fund the community center renovation. And they came to First National, I said, putting the pieces together. And you're the one reviewing it. Dad's eyes gleamed with a mix of disbelief and determination. Karen filed the loan request the same day she issued our parking ticket. Sometimes life connects the dots in strange and perfect ways. This doesn't mean I can just deny it, Dad warned, still the consummate professional. But it does mean I'll be reviewing everything with a fine-toothed comb. A knock at the door interrupted us. I opened it to find another yellow citation taped to our porch. Violation. Unapproved garden plants. Fine. $200. I waved it at Dad. Are you kidding me? These plants have been here for 5 years. He read the slip, eyes scanning quickly. This was issued today, right after we spoke with Karen. That's not a coincidence. I muttered. No, Dad said quietly. It's not. This has gotten personal. That night, sleep was impossible. From my window, I watched Karen's house across the street. Her lights were still on. I wondered if she had any idea what was coming. The next morning, the mailman dropped off a certified letter from the HOA. Violation garbage cans visible from street. Fine, $250. I held it up at breakfast. They weren't even out. Dad didn't respond right away. Instead, he opened his laptop and started typing furiously. What are you doing? I asked, leaning over his shoulder. Research, he said. Due diligence is part of every loan process. By lunch, he'd uncovered something surprising. The HOAs applied for 3 different loans in the past 2 years, all with different banks. 2 were denied. Why? I asked. That's what I'm trying to find out. That afternoon, he made a series of calls in his banker voice. I caught phrases like, reconcile these figures, and audit inconsistencies. I didn't understand most of it, but I could tell it was serious. When Mom got home, we filled her in. As a real estate attorney, she had plenty to say. HOAs are legally required to maintain detailed financial records, she said, and every member has the right to review them. Even if the president hates us? I asked. Especially if she does. Mom grinned. Let's request everything. Together we wrote a formal letter asking for 5 years of HOA financial records. Dad hand-delivered it the next evening. I watched from the living room as Karen opened her door. Even across the street I saw her smile drop when she realized who it was. When Dad came back in, he looked satisfied. She tried to refuse it. I reminded her that denying a formal request breaks the bylaws. What did she say? I asked. She said she'd deliver the records within 30 days, the maximum time allowed. She's stalling, Mum said, trying to clean things up. Not if the bank needs those same records in 10 business days, Dad said with a wink. The following week was tense. More citations arrived. For a low-hanging tree branch, a hose left out, for mail not retrieved quickly enough. Each one more ridiculous than the last. Meanwhile, things were heating up at the HOA office. My friend Jake, whose mom was the secretary, passed along a tip at lunch. They're freaking out, he said. Karen keeps yelling that everything has to be perfect for the bank inspection. 2 days later, a large envelope showed up at Dad's office, full of the HOA's financial records. That night, the dining table disappeared under piles of documents. Mom and Dad pored over everything like detectives. Look at this, Mom said, pointing at a spreadsheet. They charged homeowners for services they never provided. And here, Dad added, expenses listed with no receipts. By morning, they had a list of 27 discrepancies. Dad took the list to work to compare with the official loan application. When he came home, his face said it all. It's worse than we thought, he said. They reported more income than what's in their actual books. Is that illegal? I asked. It's fraud, Mom said flatly. The next day, Karen approached me at the mailbox. Your father needs to approve that loan, she snapped, pointing a manicured finger in my face. This renovation benefits the whole community. I stepped back. He has to follow banking laws. If everything's in order, it won't be a problem. Her expression darkened. Tell him I'd hate to see your family buried in fees. Maybe if the loan process goes smoothly, we could make some of those citations disappear. My heart raced. Are you trying to bribe us? Karen's cheeks flushed. Don't be ridiculous. I'm just saying it's good to be cooperative. I walked away, hands trembling. When I told Dad, he got very quiet. She just crossed a line, he said, grabbing his phone. He spent the next hour on a call with the bank's legal team. When he hung up, His face was grim. "This isn't about parking anymore," he said. "This is about fraud and attempted coercion. The bank's launching a formal investigation." That night, I saw Karen and 3 HOA board members meeting at her house, lights on late into the evening. The story spread like wildfire through the neighborhood. People came to our door, whispering rumors. Is the HOA broke? Is the renovation cancelled? Is Karen under investigation? I answered honestly. Dad can't talk about it, but the bank's doing a full review. 3 days before the next HOA meeting, a moving truck pulled into Treasurer Bob Wilson's driveway. And that's when everything really began to unravel. By nightfall, Bob Wilson and his family had vanished without saying goodbye to a soul. The neighborhood buzzed with gossip, but I had a pretty good idea what had happened. The community center's meeting room was packed wall to wall. I'd never seen anything like it. People lined the walls, sat cross-legged on the floor, even leaned into doorways to hear. Karen looked rattled as she fiddled with papers at the head table, her usual poise noticeably shaken. "I call this meeting to order," she announced, her voice just a bit unsteady. "First, I'd like to clear up some false information circulating about our loan request." Dad sat near the back, calm and collected with his notepad open. Mom, fully in attorney mode, had her phone recording every word. "The community center renovation is still moving forward," Karen said, her voice overly cheerful. "The bank had some routine questions. That's expected for a loan of this size." Mr. Peterson, our next-door neighbor, raised his hand. "Is it true Bob Wilson moved out because of issues with HOA money?" Karen's smile froze. Bob relocated for personal matters. It had nothing to do with HOA finances. Now, as I was saying, what about the 3 prior loan rejections? Mrs. Gomez called out from the back. The air got thick. Karen scanned the room and locked eyes with Dad. "I don't know where these lies are coming from," she snapped, "but they're completely baseless." Dad stood. The room went quiet. "My name is Thomas Reynolds," he said evenly. "I'm a senior loan officer at First National Bank. As part of full transparency, I want to share that I've been assigned to review the HOA's loan application." Karen quickly cut in. "Mr. Reynolds has a clear conflict of interest and should remove himself from this conversation, considering how many citations his household has received." People murmured. "The violation started after the loan was submitted," Dad explained, "and increased once I became the assigned reviewer." He held up his folder and went on. "While I can't discuss confidential banking matters, I can speak as a homeowner with access to HOA documents we formally requested." He clicked a remote and projected a spreadsheet onto the screen. "This is the financial summary shared with residents back in January. Note the income from dues." Another click. "And this is what was reported on the February loan paperwork. The figures are off by nearly $80,000. Gasps filled the room. Karen slammed her gavel. "Let's stay on topic." "I'm not done," Dad continued as the crowd settled. "The records also show reimbursements made to certain board members without receipts or supporting documentation." He flipped through several slides. Questionable payments, missing reports, and inconsistent fine enforcement. With every page, Karen's complexion lost more color. "Most alarming," Dad said, clicking again, "is this selective targeting." The screen now showed a graph. Neighborhood sections with barely any violations, where Karen's friends lived. Our block? Over 60% of the fines. Karen stood, red-faced. "This is a setup. Mr. Reynolds is twisting data to avoid taking responsibility for his own infractions." Dad didn't flinch. "All of this information has been submitted to our bank's audit department and forwarded to state oversight offices." The room erupted. People were shouting questions, demanding answers, and calling for board resignations. Amid the chaos, I spotted Diane slipping a folded note into Karen's hand. Karen read it, and her eyes widened in panic. The vice president finally banged a gavel and called for an emergency board session to discuss the findings. As the crowd began to disperse, reporters swarmed Dad. Somehow, the media had gotten wind of the whole thing. In the parking lot, Karen stormed toward us with Diane close behind. Her makeup was smudged, and her eyes red. "You've ruined everything," she spat, trembling. "You have no idea what you've done." Dad turned to face her, calm and composed. "I'm just doing my duty, as a loan officer and as a concerned homeowner." "This renovation was going to be my legacy," Karen said, her voice breaking. "I was naming the center after my late husband. I've poured years into this." For a moment, I felt a flicker of pity. "I had to bend a few rules," she went on. "It's the only way things get done in communities like this. People don't understand how hard it is to protect property values. Bending rules isn't the same as misusing community funds," Mom said softly. Karen's vulnerability vanished in a flash. "Fine, if that's how this is going to go. Just remember, I'm still HOA president. I can make your lives a nightmare." "Actually," a voice said behind us. We turned to see Mr. Gonzalez, the retired judge, from the end of the street. "The bylaws clearly allow for the removal of board members under investigation, and I believe tonight gives us enough grounds to call for a vote." Karen's face twisted in fury. "You'll regret this. All of you." She stormed off just as Dad's phone rang. He stepped away to answer, and when he returned, his expression was grim. "What happened?" I asked. "This goes deeper than we thought," he said quietly. "The audit team found links to other HOAs in the county. Karen and some of her board may be involved in a much larger scheme." "What kind of scheme?" Mom asked. Dad looked serious. "It looks like organized fraud, inflated loan documents, suspicious payments, and possible kickbacks from contractors." That night, things took a strange turn. Unfamiliar cars drove slowly past our house. Our trash cans were knocked over. Someone rang the doorbell at 3 a.m. and bolted. "They're trying to scare us," Mom said the next morning as we cleaned up. Dad nodded. "Which means we're right on target." By afternoon, news vans were parked outside. As I walked home from the bus stop, a reporter jumped in front of me. "Is it true your father uncovered a multi-million-dollar HOA scam?" she asked, microphone shoved in my face. I froze, unsure what to say. Dad appeared at my side like clockwork. "No comment at this time," he said firmly, "but a public statement is coming." Inside, we found Mom deep in conversation on the phone. "I think it's time to involve the district attorney's office," she was saying to a colleague. This had moved far beyond HOA rules or lawn citations. What started as neighborhood politics had pulled us into something far more serious. As Dad fielded calls from banking higher-ups and Mum connected with legal experts, I sat back and tried to understand how we, an average family, ended up at the heart of what looked like a county-wide criminal case. What none of us saw coming was that Karen still had one last, desperate card to play, and she was willing to risk it all to shut us up. Flashes went off the moment I opened our front door. 3 news vans were now stationed along the curb. A crowd of reporters stood by the sidewalk, mics ready. "Is it true the HOA president vandalized your property?" one shouted. I stood frozen, completely overwhelmed by the media chaos. Dad gently pulled me back inside. "Mrs. Garcia sent Channel 5 her security footage," he said. "They caught Karen and Diane on camera, digging up our garden, 2 in the morning. My phone buzzed with a flood of notifications. The Pinecrest Gardens community page had exploded. 126 new posts, People I barely knew were suddenly sharing their own horror stories, paint jobs they were forced to redo, trees chopped down without notice, fines for things no one could see. They're planning a meeting at the Jacksons tonight, I told Dad, scrolling fast. They want to go over the financial stuff you uncovered. He nodded, serious. I have to tread carefully. Some of this ties into the bank's internal process. If I say the wrong thing, it could jeopardize my job. Another knock at the door. This time, it was Officer Martinez with a slim folder in her hands. We're filing charges. Criminal mischief and trespassing, she said. But you should know, Ms. Matthews just filed a harassment claim against your family. My stomach twisted. Harassment? We haven't done anything. She says your father is using his position at the bank to wage a personal vendetta. She's demanding the bank reassign the loan application to someone else. Dad let out a dry laugh. The audit was triggered by inconsistencies in their financial documents. Any loan officer would have flagged them. We barely had time to digest that when my sister burst in. Have you seen this? She said, shoving her phone at us. An email sent to every homeowner in Pinecrest Gardens. Karen had just called an emergency HOA meeting. The subject, alleged criminal activity and financial sabotage. By us. That night at the Jacksons, their house was packed. People stood shoulder to shoulder, on the stairs, in the kitchen, pressed into corners. Mr. Jackson handed out copies of the HOA's financials, all with suspicious expenses clearly highlighted. Karen billed the HOA for 6 steakhouse dinners at Rosario's last month, Mrs. Smith read, adjusting her glasses. Who was she dining with? And why does an HOA need nearly $2,500 in business meals? One by one, the details came out. Landscaping invoices from Karen's brother-in-law, event budgets that somehow ended up at day spas, a monthly consulting fee paid to Diane with zero documentation. I've drafted a petition to remove the current board immediately, Mr. Jackson said, holding it up. We checked with a lawyer. If we get 70% of homeowners to sign, we can trigger a special election. The doorbell rang, and the room froze. Relief swept through when Mrs. Jackson came back with Mr. Lopez, the retired judge, from the end of the block. I've reviewed these documents, he said. This goes beyond mismanagement. It's embezzlement. Gasps rippled through the crowd. That word meant something serious. It meant criminal charges. Just then, my phone lit up, a message from an unknown number. Back off, or your dad's career is over. I have friends. I silently handed the phone to Dad. His jaw clenched. She's threatening us now, he said to the room. That sent another wave of outrage through the neighbors. I've had it, Ms. Wong said, rising from the couch. I'm an accountant. I'll help organize all of this for the district attorney. We spent the rest of the evening working, assigning tasks, collecting signatures, organizing files. The energy in the room was electric, part anger, part purpose. People who had lived near each other for years were finally connecting. As we walked home under the streetlights, Dad slipped an arm over my shoulder. I'm proud of how you're handling this, he said softly. Standing up to people like her. It takes guts. But what if she actually goes after your job? I asked. Before he could reply, headlights swept across the road. Karen's luxury SUV crept past our house, then sped off. Loud and clear, she was watching. Dad gave my shoulder a squeeze. Sometimes doing what's right comes with consequences, he said. But letting someone like her bully an entire neighborhood? That's an even bigger cost. That night, sleep wouldn't come. The petition already had 63 signatures. So close. Tomorrow's emergency meeting loomed like a final showdown. I kept glancing out the window, expecting shadows in our garden, but the yard was calm under the moon. Then my laptop pinged. An email. From Diana Matthews, Karen's daughter. Subject, the safe behind Mom's desk. Dad leaned over my shoulder, voice urgent. Delete that Now, it's probably bait. They'll say we hacked her office. I hovered over delete, but something made me stop. What if she's trying to help? What if she's done with her mum's lies too? The community center was tense the next night. Residents trickled in, whispering to each other. Karen stood at the podium, perfectly styled, though the worry showed around her eyes. Behind her, the other board members stared at the floor. "Thank you all for coming," she began, trying for cheerful. "I want to address the rumors being spread about our HOA board." Behind her, the projector showed neat, polished spreadsheets, financial records that looked nothing like what Dad had reviewed. "As you can see, our financials are clear and professionally managed. These accusations are false and clearly personal." My heart sank. She'd forged the books. How were we supposed to prove it? Dad raised his hand. Karen ignored him, but Mr. Lopez stood. "Point of order. Members are entitled to speak at emergency meetings." Karen's smile twitched. "Fine. Mr. Reynolds, 2 minutes." Dad didn't take the podium. He walked straight to the center of the room. "The financials on screen don't match what I've seen as part of the loan application," he said evenly. "I believe what's being shown is altered." Karen laughed coldly. "Big claims require big evidence. Can you prove these aren't the real documents?" The room held its breath. We had copies, but how could we verify which was real? My phone buzzed again. Another email. "Safe code 241832. Records are inside. Hurry." "Diana." I showed Dad. He whispered to Mr. Jackson, who nodded and slipped quietly out of the room. Meanwhile, Dad continued pressing Karen. "This $8,700 charge for landscaping. This business doesn't even appear in public state records." Karen flushed. "That's ridiculous. Martinez Landscaping is—" "Your brother-in-law's unlicensed company," Mrs. Smith interrupted, "and he doesn't even have a landscaping license." Voices exploded. Karen banged the gavel, shouting over the crowd. Then the doors burst open. Mr. Jackson strode in, holding up a worn green ledger. "Found in the office safe," he declared. "These are the real books." Karen lunged for him. "That's private property. You broke into my office." "No," Diana said, stepping through behind him. "I let them in. I'm done with the lies, Mom." The room went still. Karen stared at her daughter, shocked. "Diana, what are you doing?" "The right thing," Diana said gently. "Something you used to teach me." Mr. Lopez took the ledger, flipping through it. "This confirms misappropriation and matches the bank's records." Karen's face collapsed. Diana reached her side. "I'm sorry, Mom, but this has to end." Karen looked around the room, faces filled with disappointment, betrayal, resolve. Her shoulders sagged. Mr. Lopez cleared his throat. "Per our bylaws, we can now vote on immediate removal." The tally wasn't even close. 92% voted to replace the entire board. Karen and her allies walked out without a word. Diana stayed behind. "I know what she did was wrong," she told us later. "I tried for months to make her stop. She always said it was for the neighborhood." The following week changed everything. A temporary board was elected. Mr. Jackson took over as president. The district attorney's office opened a formal investigation. Dad asked to be removed from the loan process just to avoid any bias. One quiet evening, our doorbell rang. Karen stood there, not in her usual business attire, but in jeans and a hoodie. "Is your father home?" she asked softly. Dad invited her in. From the stairs, I watched them talk at the kitchen table. "I paid back the money," she said, "and I'm selling the house. I came to apologize." Dad listened silently. "You could have pushed this further," she added. "You didn't." "That wasn't the point," Dad replied. "We just wanted what was fair for everyone." She nodded and left. Later, Dad explained she'd reached a settlement, full repayment plus penalties, in exchange for no criminal prosecution from the HOA. 6 weeks later, Moving trucks pulled into her driveway. That afternoon, Diana stopped by. "She's going to live with my aunt in Arizona," she told us. "I think it'll be good for her." "And you?" "I'm staying. This is still home." She gave a small smile. "Maybe we can be friends now." Spring rolled in with a fresh energy. New bylaws were passed, clearer, balanced, with real checks. Mr. Jackson hosted the first ever Pinecrest block party, complete with permitted street parking. Kids played, neighbors laughed, people mingled. Sitting on our front steps, I looked around and realized something big had changed. Fear had been replaced by community. Dad sat beside me. "Deep thoughts?" he asked. I nodded. "It's strange. If they hadn't fined us for parking in our own driveway." He chuckled. "Sometimes you have to stand up, not just for yourself, but for everyone a rule hurts." As the evening wound down, our driveway filled again with neighbors' cars and smiles. No citations, no threats, just people looking out for one another. Under the stars, Diana joined us as we locked up. "My mom called today," she said. "She's doing better. I think seeing real consequences helped." I nodded. "Healing starts in different ways?" "You know what's funny?" she added, glancing at all the parked cars. "This all started with a stupid parking ticket." I laughed. "And now we can't find an empty spot." "Sometimes," she said, "the smallest injustice shows you the biggest cracks. And fixing it, that's how you build something stronger." She was right. That night I finally understood. In a neighborhood, what really matters isn't the rules or the lawns. It's the people, and the courage to fight for what's right.